I will not cry yet. We'll see. Maybe they'll come out later on in the message. But yeah, it's been fun to go over these last few weeks and talk about the type of church that we aim to be and become more of. And over the last 2 weeks, we have seen so far that we desire to be a church that follows Jesus, submitting to the Spirit and growing in relationship with the Father through acts of worship and service. We also desire to be a church that embraces Scripture as our foundation for theological reflection with grace and humility, discerning the essentials for faith and life. We want to live life together, guided by love for one another, joyfully practicing generous hospitality, and pursuing reconciliation with God and one another in a diverse and egalitarian community. This week, we are looking at the fourth value, which is that we desire to be a church that shares Christ's love with our neighbors and engages in local and global partnerships characterized by mercy and justice. As we heard read for us this morning in our scripture passages, one passage of scripture I come back to over and over and over again when I think about what it means for us to be intentional about loving our neighbors locally and how we engage in local and global partnerships is Jeremiah 29, 4-7. I believe that the same principles that we use to guide us as we live missionally here also guide how we engage in international ministry. Because even though an international location may seem foreign to us or the people that are sent out there, it is local to the people that live there, and so the same principles apply. I know that I have spoken on this passage before and broken it down into pieces for us, but I'm going to do that again this morning as a little bit of a recap. And in this passage, we are instructed to build homes and plan to stay, to plant gardens and eat the food that they produce. In verse 6, we see that it speaks to setting down roots, building family and community. We are then instructed to work for the peace and prosperity of the city and to pray to the Lord for it. Underlying the first 3 points is a theme of being rooted. Building deep relational community takes time. Whether you're living in a neighborhood in Edmonton or a community in Cameroon, the biggest and most lasting impact you'll have is on places where you stay. The final 2 points, I would say, speak more to posture. It is an instruction to seek the peace and prosperity of the city to which they were taken into as exiles. This likely wasn't a city that they loved, and they also very likely did not want it to thrive. But in seeking the peace of the city, they are also instructed to pray for it. And as I have thought about this, I believe that shows a posture of humility. It shows a trust that God is in control. It shows that while we may not always understand or be happy about the decisions made by local leadership, we are still called to pray for our city. And in this circumstance specifically, Jeremiah admonishes them to pray for their captors. One commentator noted that this is similar to the passage we see in Matthew 5:43, where Jesus says, "You have heard the law that says, 'Love your neighbor and hate your enemy.' But I say, love your enemies. Pray for those who persecute you. In that way, you will be acting as true children of your Father in heaven." The commentator continued to say that unique in ancient literature was Jeremiah's command for them to pray for their pagan captors. Throughout the centuries, the precepts enjoined here have been followed by the Jews in dispersion. To this day, they pray in their worship on the Sabbath and on festivals for the rulers under whom they are living. And I think the word "for" is really important here. We're not told to pray at the city or about the city, but for the city. And this tiny 3-letter word seems small, but I think it makes a big difference in how we approach our prayers. I have found that when I pray about a situation or maybe about a person in my life, I pray likely much differently than if I'm actually praying for them. I have found it difficult to really stay upset or angry at someone or a situation if I am praying for them. And praying for someone or something changes my attitude and posture towards them. So in Jeremiah's words, we are encouraged to put down roots, invest in the city, and pray for it. But you may be wondering how that connects to the idea of sharing Christ's love with our neighbors. And I would say that the best way we can live into this value is by building relationships with people. Our other scripture passage this morning was John 13, verses 34 through 35, where Jesus says, "A new command I give you, love one another. As I have loved you, so you must love one another. By this, everyone will know that you are my disciples, if you love one another." In the New Living Translation, verse 35 says that your love for one another will prove to the world that you are my disciples. Pastor Chris also used this passage last week to look how it applies within our church community as we love each other, and I would add that it also applies to how we love our neighbors, and Chris alluded to that as well. How we treat one another in our church community gives people a glimpse of how we might treat those outside of our community circles. One of the things that I would tell short-term missions teams when we were traveling was that just as much as it matters how we say and do things with the people that we were there to serve and connect with, our team relationships were important too, because the way that we loved and cared for one another as a group reflected how well we would care for those outside of it. This verse also implies that we are to be a people motivated by love. There are many stories of how the early Christians disrupted the norms and caused ripple effects throughout communities because of the ways that they cared for people. Harold Attridge writes that several impulses run through the history of early Christian treatment of the poor. At the heart of the good news that Jesus preached and that his evangelists recorded is first a proclamation of the coming reign of God, a state of affairs in which justice and peace would be the norm, when the promises found in the prophets of Israel would be realized. The proclamation involved both a message of hope and also a critique of the world as it is. Alongside the proclamation, the second major impulse in the teachings of Jesus was a challenge to radical obedience to the will of God, an obedience that would make eschatological hope concrete and present through rejection of material possessions. Such radical obedience may have been a somewhat precarious way to have an impact on the lives of people, hence the third impulse, which marked the Christian movement from its inception. It consisted of systemic efforts to do just that, to hear and respond to the cry of the poor. Jesus' proclamation of the coming reign of God offered a message of hope to widows, orphans, the blind and lame, those who also received special treatment in the Torah and prophets of ancient Israel. Another article emphasized this by saying, though the gospel is a message and must be proclaimed, the early church saw works of mercy and preaching the gospel as two sides of the same coin. Sharing Christ's love to others involves both acts of service, acts that work towards justice and mercy, as well as words that speak to why we do what we do. Our roots as the North American Baptist Conference of Churches are also based on this. Walter Rauschenbusch, son of one of the co-founders of NAB, became one of the main leaders in the social gospel movement, and he believed that Christianity proclaims a new kingdom and is therefore inescapably revolutionary. "I am a member," he wrote, "of the most revolutionary society that has ever existed on earth, the disciples of Jesus." There is an element of proclamation, giving words to why we do what we do when we love people as Jesus would love them. And there's an element of serving, caring for all people. Loving our neighbors means that we do both. And it requires us to develop the discernment to know when each or both may be required in a situation. In my time at Greenfield, I think we've worked well at navigating these two postures. There are things that we do with or for the community, like the bike tune-up or the community garage and car boot sale, where we are just simply being a presence in the community. We are building relationships with people, hopefully showing them that we care for the community that we are planted in, so that if there should ever be a time when they would want to ask spiritual questions or wonder about trying us out as a church, that we have built enough relationship and presence that they would feel safe to do so. There isn't an element of verbal proclamation of Christ's love when we are doing events like that, but I do believe that our actions proclaim that we are here and we are for our community. Then there are events that are somewhat in between. We have started doing in-person neighborhood dinners, and while largely they are a space to bring neighbors together over a meal, and there isn't a gospel presentation made, it is a space where we are able to have deeper conversations with our neighbors. We present a clear invitation to join us at the special services that take place around the timing of the meals, which so far has been Christmas and Easter. But as table hosts, we're able to sit and hear people's stories. And I know that at Christmas, I was able to enter into some conversations around faith, sharing some of my story and hearing from others. And then there are other things that we invite our neighbors into, like the Blue Christmas service or Alpha, where the faith content is very obvious. I also think that we are a fairly welcoming community on a Sunday morning. And by and large, I believe people feel welcomed when they come into our building. Greeting, ushering, welcoming people on a Sunday morning is such an important way that we can show Christ's love to others. It shows love to those who are here week after week and to those who may come through the doors for the very first time. If you serve on those teams, please know that you are so appreciated and valued. Your ministry is important to us. And in the same way that as a church, we have multiple spaces and ways of sharing Christ's love with our neighbors and the communities that surround us, I would encourage us to think through what that might look like in our own lives. As an example of what this could look like, in his book, Faithful Presence, David Fitch writes about 3 circles in which we engage and are present with others. I'm going to read an excerpt from the book, but a little background I think is helpful. So he writes about 7 disciplines or practices which he believes help to shape our churches for a posture of mission. And so when he uses the word discipline in this section, that's what he's talking about. And after he describes the disciplines, he talks about what they look like, and then he refers what they look like in each of these 3 circles that he will refer to. So David writes that he proposes that the disciplines are best understood as on the move. They occupy 3 spaces continually, what he calls the close circle, the dotted circle, and the half circle. The discipline first creates a close circle of committed subjects to Christ. All are in mutual submission to Christ and to one another. He calls this the close circle as opposed to the closed circle, because this circle does not exclude people from it. Rather, because all are committed Christians carefully discerning their submission to Christ and to one another under his reign, there's a social closeness that is supernatural. And Jesus, as the host, is at the center of this space. Here, the intensity of the presence of Christ is known like nowhere else. This incarnational presence of Christ, however, does not remain in the close circle. It is extended by these same people to a second space in the neighborhood. This space is represented as a dotted circle because even though this space is still defined by a circle of committed followers of Jesus, there is space for neighbors and strangers to enter in and watch what God is doing here. Here, the Christian disciple is the host. The disciple gathers people together, often in a home, into Christ's presence in the neighborhood via the disciplines. Christ's presence, however, does not remain here either. Indeed, Christ's presence goes with us into the many places we inhabit with the hurting and broken of the world. This space is a half circle because here the Christian goes among the world as a guest. Here the Christian also extends the special presence of Christ into the world, just as with the dotted circle. But here we discern Christ's presence as a guest among the hurting and the wandering. In this half circle, the question is never whether Christ is here or not, but rather it is whether his presence will be welcomed. All 3 circles are part and parcel of each discipline on the move. This is a pattern throughout the New Testament. The church gathers in its place of worship to encounter Christ's presence. But this same church is sent out to extend his presence into our homes, our neighborhoods, and among the marginalized and hurting in the world. The church's location, therefore, cannot be seen in terms of in here or out there. It is an entire way of life. For most of us, the close circle will be a Sunday morning gathering like this one, possibly a life group or a prayer meeting. It is primarily a space of connection and worship with other Jesus followers. And as David writes, they are not closed spaces, but they are close because of spiritual relationship that is developed amongst fellow believers. For the dotted circle and for the half circle, that could look fairly different from person to person. An example of a dotted circle might be something like if one of our life groups hosted a backyard barbecue and invited neighbors or coworkers into it. Or maybe hosting a book club in your home. The half circle could look like a variety of things as well. Here we go among the world into our neighborhoods as guests. When we set up a table at the Greenfield Community League Day to talk about NCN, the Neighborhood Care Network, Or this past fall, I did crafts with kids. We are there as guests. Maybe you have a regular night out with friends or colleagues that wouldn't consider themselves to be followers of Jesus, and when you are in that space, you bring the presence of Christ with you as guest. The dotted and half circles are largely where our faith gets tested and put into action. Are we willing to follow Jesus into those spaces and love others as he has commanded us to? One of the beautiful things about David's layout of the circles is that as we seek to discern what spaces God might be prompting us to share his love in with our neighbors or those around us, it is not necessarily a requirement that we add more things into our lives. The longer I'm here at Greenfield and the more I hear of some of your stories, I know that there are some beautiful examples of how we as people and community are living into this desire to share Christ's love with our neighbors, engaging in both local and international partnerships that are characterized by mercy and justice. And we'll hear a couple of those stories in just a moment, but I would encourage all of us to take time this week to talk through the spaces in our lives where we can be the presence of Jesus in these dotted or half-circle spaces. Maybe it's your workplace, sports team, book club, rock climbing gym. If after taking some time to reflect on the spaces you're in, you realize that maybe there isn't somewhere that you already participate as guest, I would encourage you to consider one opportunity that you can engage in. I know that for me, for many years working in my previous church, I didn't really have that half-circle space, and I'm not sure that I really had a dotted circle space. People would often joke that I slept at Greenfield, and while I never actually did, there were definitely times it would have been helpful and where it felt like I did. My life was our church community, and I loved serving them, but I lost out on the richness of having other spaces in my life. And not that there were no spaces where I interacted with others that may have thought or lived differently than I did, but I wasn't frequently or intentionally involved in those environments. I had to do some reevaluating and did start to find some spaces where I was connecting with others as guests, but that took some intentional shifts. So when I moved to Edmonton to be at Greenfield, that was one of the things that I knew would be very important for me to find. It's taken time and, again, intentional creation of space. But for me, currently the main space where I'm involved in my community as neighbor and guest is with our community league and currently serving on the board. And the more that I get to know that team, the more I'm enjoying getting to be part of my neighborhood in that way. And I have a few suggestions that I want to give around possible entry points if you are wondering what finding these spaces could look like for you. But before we do that, I want to ask Karen and Doug Miller to join me on stage. I'm going to ask them about some of their experiencing with loving their neighbors, and then we'll show 2 short stories from 2 of our mission partners about what that looks like for them as well. So Karen and Doug, please join me. So Karen and Doug might be new faces to some, very familiar to others. They've been part of our community for a while, and as I've gotten to know both of them, I have really appreciated their heart for hospitality and how they care for each other. And so they are going to speak to what this has looked like for them kind of in their community and then also with the Neighborhood Care Network. I'm going to start by reading out just a list of questions, and then Karen will answer, and then Doug will answer as well. So the first one was, in your lives, what has it looked like for you to share Christ's love with your neighbors? And the second was, what are some things you have learned along this journey of loving your neighbors, and how have you seen God working in your lives and the lives of your neighbors?
So before I begin, I need to confess that given the choice, I would rather organize a meal for 150 than stand here talking to you. In my life, what does it look like to share Christ with neighbors? Oh my goodness, this is shaking. I think I take a bit of a passive approach and go with the thought that my life may be the only Bible some people ever experience, and hopefully they can see Christ's love through my words and actions. I do what I feel God has gifted me with, and so hosting or helping to organize the NCN dinners feels natural to me. Some things I've learned along the way, that people are more than willing to help out when asked, and you guys have really shown great color in that. We can never go wrong by providing the very basic need of food to people. And the way, This is getting worse. Can I do the dinner now? Can you hold that?
You can also put it on the stand.
Thanks. Ways I have seen God working in my life and in the lives of neighbors. I've also volunteer at the Meals on Wheels kitchen, and one of the ways that I saw God working impacting me was that there was one day early in my time there that I was feeling really down and cranky and wondering what I was doing there. And I heard this voice in my head, which sometimes isn't a good thing, but it was a good thing this time, that said, "Whatever you do for the least of these, you do for me." I haven't had a bad day there since. Last Christmas, when we were doing the NCN dinner, all three churches, Greenfield, Dayspring, and Enjoy Life, had participants helping. And it was extremely cool for me to see two ladies from different churches just spontaneously praying with and for each other. It was one of those God moments of God blessing the workers as well as us being able to bless those that we were feeding. And this year at the dinner, it was thrilling for me to see and hear people who didn't know each other connecting over a meal. It made all the work behind the scenes worth it just to hear the chatter and laughter. That being said, I am only one part of this event, and it takes a lot of people, each doing their own part. We are a body that works together.
So before I start, we need to acknowledge that while we are up here talking about hospitality, we're just one couple of many, many people in the church who engage in hospitality as part of their faith journey. And it's just very exciting, and we also have a lot to learn, and we can learn from those others as well by hearing their stories and finding out what their path has been like. Growing up as a non-believer, being invited into the homes of people when I was becoming a believer, and then when I moved to Edmonton, it made all the difference to me. Like, what does this mean? Why am I being invited in here? Why do they care? And it really did mean a lot. So some of my observations about hospitality, it requires a desire to be welcoming and a willingness to talk to others and make time and space for them. It happened too late in my journey through this, but I realized how much I need to pray for the opportunity to relate to others. I feel like, no, I can do that. I'm outgoing and I can talk with people, but no, have God participate in this. It's His mission, and it's really important for Him to be engaged from my perspective in what He's doing. Sara-May used a really cool term a moment ago, entry points, and sometimes I think that's where we struggle, and it stops us from reaching out in hospitality because we don't get the essence of entry points. I find that in a neighborhood, it's really important to be aware of changes that are happening, any kind of changes, a birth, a death, a marriage, an ambulance that shows up, a house that's burning, like these things we should be able to notice, and it always creates opportunities to engage people, like to just listen and care and show love. And I mean, all of those things have happened in our neighborhood in the last little while, and it really does open doors. Before you can really engage in hospitality, you need to get to know people. You need to know something about them. Names, what they do, kids, pets, whatever, what their interests are. And when you start connecting with them and being friendly with them, it opens doors so that you can share Christ's love with them in deeper ways. Remember to pray for God to guide you in this relationship building, and pray for those opportunities, and acknowledge God's role in the connections as He has placed you where you are as part of His mission in your community. So, we're okay for time still? Okay, another hour and a half should be good. What I've learned, hospitality, as Sara-May said, and I learned this by listening to the core three people, hospitality is a posture or a mindset. And this mindset frees people to engage in hospitality inside or outside the home. It doesn't, if you're not comfortable with it, it doesn't mean you have to invite people into your home. You could invite somebody to go out for coffee if that's easier for you, and that just totally works. in terms of inviting people in, we learned that it's a mistake to think we should be serving these people, we should be doing everything, we should be providing everything. That's a real mistake. We did a Sunday school course here, or we as students, and in the art of neighboring, and it was fascinating because it just changed that mindset completely. You invite people in, people want to bring stuff, they want to help. So we took it a step further and thought, when we're inviting people in, let's just intentionally not do some of the stuff we thought we would do to prepare ahead of time. Don't cut the fruit. Don't get the table fully set. Because when people come in, is there anything I can do to help? Yes. Would you like to cut the fruit and bring the chairs to the table or whatever? And it helps them feel like they're participating in what's happening in the home, and they're much more engaged in the whole hospitality circumstance. Oh, yeah, awkward one. We learned that people aren't projects. Like, we hear this, love our neighbors. Does that mean that is a project? We need to do A, B, and C, and D, very formulaic, to show love to our neighbors? No, they're people. Care about them like you would want to be cared about. That was an important lesson to learn. Another important one, hospitality is more often about taking initiative than having good intentions or anything else. I always view the word should as sort of the Baptist guilt word. We should get together. If you can, try to avoid that trap or landmine, because from your side, it's a good intention, but initiative is what makes all the difference. From their side, they might be desperate to get together with somebody, and when they hear should, they think, yes, we're going to be invited, and then if it doesn't happen, that doesn't do what I think you intended for it to do. Excuse me. I've got one other point and then an actual neighbor story. In terms of being hospitable to those in grief, try to avoid that trap of saying, what can I do for you? They're not in a mindset where they can answer that question at all. So this is where you need to step forward and take some initiative and bring them a meal, bake them cookies, give them a card, have a quick visit with them, have a phone call with them. Taking the initiative there is really important because those people are hurting. If you've ever been in grief yourself, you know what that means. It's, I can't. I've had 10 people say, what can I do? I'm not going to come up with a project list and, well, could you mow my lawn? And, but hey, I saw a guy out shoveling my snow. That's wonderful. That was meaningful. Okay. Got an actual neighbor story, and then I will. So my neighbor, let's call him Bill, because that's his name. So about 2 years ago, his son died suddenly, and I was out in Vancouver, I think, at the time, and one of the other neighbors found out about this and started caring, and then when I got back, we took a meal to him, and funny, because he had been in our home, and he asked me who I was when I came to the door. He could have been in grief, and he didn't have that capacity. And, oh, I'm Doug, we live right across the street, so sorry to hear about your son. And so we were, after being neighbors with him for over 20 years, this time came up where it just seemed like it was fluid to show a lot of care. His wife died in December, and same thing, we went over and started taking meals, but we weren't the only neighbors doing that. I actually crossed paths with one of our other neighbors who was bringing a meal at the same time, which is very cool. We can rely on the communities around us to participate in caring, and then maybe we can coordinate something with them. And then last Sunday we had a small group at our place. Yeah, as people are leaving, ambulance across the street, Bill's off to the hospital. And our neighbors beside them, they went with him to the hospital, and they were there with him till midnight to find out what was going on. And when he got back on Tuesday, took a meal, had a visit with him, and he disclosed how lonely it has been since his wife passed away. He didn't expect that. And so just showing up. I mentioned somebody this morning that frequency of visits is more important than the duration of visits. So if they know that their day is being broken up by somebody coming by to care, that's really important. Just a concluding comment. It may not be for us to know where the relationship is going. It's just valuable to be willing to be on the road with people God has put into our path.
Thank you. And if we can show the video and then...
assignment around Hamilton, Ontario. Our next door neighbor, she's going through cancer treatment, and the small, simple way we show we care to her is we shovel her driveway and walkway when it snows.
Hi there, I'm Lindell. One of the ways I've been able to love my neighbors is very practical. About a year ago, the neighbor who lives above us in our apartment building had just gotten out of the shower and was in her robe and decided at that moment to gather her garbage and take it out to bins that we have in our stairwell where we deposit all of our garbage. And while she was outside of her apartment doing that, the wind slammed her apartment door shut, and she lives alone, and she was left in a very vulnerable situation. And so she immediately came to our apartment and was crying, was very upset, and asked if she could use her cell phone, or our cell phone, my cell phone now, to call her daughter. And so I let her in, and I let her use my phone, and I offered her some tea, and I offered her a place to wait while her daughter came so she didn't have to be stuck out in the hallway. And I was able to pray for her in that moment and just hear a little bit about the struggles that she's had since losing her husband a few years ago. And because of that moment that we spent together, she's actually invited me up to her apartment a couple of times now to help her with other things. And we've been able to build even more on the relationship, this neighbor relationship that we've had. And so it's been a great way to get to know her better and to, consider her a friend now. And my hope is that as we continue to see each other and have these times together, that she will see the love that Jesus has for her and accept him as her Savior.
So as we've heard from Karen and Doug, and thank you for doing that for us this morning, and from Walter and Lindell, one of the things that stands out to me when I hear these stories is the simplicity of it. And as we talk about missional living, what does it look like for us to love our neighbors? How do we be present to the world as followers of Jesus? I think we can sometimes feel some guilt or shame or pressure that we should be, for me, holding floor-wide dinner parties in my apartment building every week, or sometimes, something big. And so often it is really those small spaces, those small moments in time where we are just simply present. I appreciate what Karen said about finding those ways that you are gifted and stepping into that. So the way that I am going to more naturally love those around me may not be the same way that somebody else does it. And I have found so much freedom in that over the years, because you tend to hear these big inspirational speakers about, go do this big thing, and that is not how I am wired. So just finding those simple ways that you just naturally connect with people around you that you already know, and then extending that into other spaces is really important. And again, that idea of being present and being aware of what is going on around us. And I think, instead of, if you have tendencies like me spiraling in those moments where you think you should be doing those big, big things and you don't know where to start, I would encourage you to take some time to relax and lean into what the Spirit might already be doing. Lindell gave shelter to a neighbor that was vulnerable, and now they are developing a lovely relationship. The Grobs are shoveling sidewalks. The Millers are being aware of what is going on in their community, preparing meals, inviting people in. And more than these things that we do often, the important piece is that we are being present. Again, I would encourage you this week to take time to reflect on ways in which you may already share Christ's love with your neighbors. And that could be the people that you live next to, the people that you work with. And And are there ways you are being intentional in the ways you connect with others? And if not, is there one thing you could do with one person or situation this week that may give you the opportunity to show God's love to someone either now or sometime down the road as you plant the seeds? And if you aren't sure where to start, I wanted to just quickly talk about 3 things that I have found helpful in my journey. And Doug mentioned this as well, but for me, the biggest place to start has been with prayer. Just simply pausing and asking God what he is doing in the world around me. The stories that I hear of people who have prayed simple prayers as they walk around their neighborhood of like, Lord, we want to be your people. We want to be light to those around us, but we don't know where to start. Often has led them into situations they would never actually have planned for themselves or would have anticipated coming. But they are just beautiful moments where they get to step into the lives of people, sometimes who are hurting and going through really difficult things. Other times life is going fine and they're just asking faith questions and kind of in a place to step into that more. But when they lead with that piece of prayer and inviting God to just highlight to them who that person or situation might be, they're able to step into it with the boldness that I know I don't often feel maybe on my own if I haven't led with that prayer piece. So start with prayer, whether it's on your own, with a spouse, with roommate, with other people from Greenfield that live in your neighborhood. That is one of the places I would encourage us to start and then keep going back to over and over. Another resource that if you're looking for maybe how to guide some of those prayers, last year with some of our life groups, we went through a book called Backyard Pilgrim. And so we do have some of those available if people would want to go through that again. There's a 40-day devotional piece, so you could do that as well. But there's also every day just a little prompt. So as you're going and walking around your neighborhood for 15 minutes, just a little prompt for you to think about as you walk around, and maybe you notice things in a way that you haven't before. And I would encourage even just that idea of prayer walking your neighborhood, so committing to walk once a week or once a day, to walk and pray. And again, then you can take note of those things that look different, and maybe this person's house has always looked immaculate, and you notice at some point that it's not. And so maybe what is going on, and is there something that you can maybe step into and care for that person? Or but when we're present and in that space, we see these things. And the other thing is, you may have seen these before, I'm guessing, but we have some of these Who is My Neighbor magnets. And they're a really simple thing, too, to also put up on your fridge. And the goal of them is to really notice some of those things that Doug talked about. So the idea is you would kind of make note of the houses that most closely surround you, and you would start filling in names. So if neighbor on this side is named Susie, you would put in Susie's name. And then the goal is, like, is there one thing you can learn about them? And it doesn't have to be, again, anything deep or profound. Maybe it is that they have a pet, or they like traveling to Hawaii, or something like that. But just having those reminders on your fridge, and then even for those blank spaces, it can just be that prompt of, well, next time you're maybe out on your street, is there a way you can get to know the person that lives in that house that you haven't had a chance to meet yet? So, it just can be a helpful way and reminder. I have one on my fridge as well to keep me mindful of the people that live around me. And finally, we have talked a lot about local things this morning, but part of this fourth value is also our global partnerships. And one of the things that we are wanting to do to step into that a little bit more, to become more aware of what is going on in the lives of our partners, is we're looking at starting a monthly time of prayer for the mission partners we support as a church. The idea would be to take some time to gather for a short time before the morning gathering and to pray for one of our partners and other needs we might be aware of. We're looking at starting that in February, either kind of around the middle of the month or the end, and then we would do it ongoing. So if that is something that interests you, stay tuned, and we will have information in our e-bulletin once we get that all finalized. So as we share Christ's love for our neighbors by engaging in local and global partnerships characterized by mercy and justice, I want to encourage us this morning to start where we already are. In our neighborhoods, I would encourage us to become rooted and present, creating space to be known and to know others, trusting that God is already at work and leading us with a posture of love. I'll invite the worship team to come forward.